Okay, welcome to the Mr. Toad Cave System presentation for the virtual NSS convention in July of 2020. This is about the longest cave system in Vermont, which is an active project of the Berkshire Area Diggers Association. For context, Mr. Toad is located in southern Vermont along the Taconics, which are a mountain range running north-south in Vermont. This is the location of most of Vermont's marble deposits, which are mostly Ordovician age. These were all offshore limestones that during the Taconic orogeny, the collision between Africa and North America, they were all folded over into basically eastern Vermont and Massachusetts and Connecticut. So almost all of Vermont's major caves are in this area, in the marble in these mountains, not in the least because the marble can be over 1,000 feet thick in places, and that leads to a lot of hydraulic head with water coming off the mountain ranges, and makes for a lot of opportunity for big cave formation. So the Mr. Toad cave system is a combination of two caves, or a connection of two caves that we found in 2014 through 2017 with a lot of digging and work. And it's currently at around 3,300 feet of passages, over 200 feet of depth, has various climbs, crawls, vertical pitches in a couple of places, lots of not quite vertical climbs in a couple of other places, lots of tight spots. For those of you who are from much larger cave regions, you might be thinking, oh, 3,300 feet, that's just not very much. Yeah, but take all of the hard parts of all the caves that you think of as being, a 3-mile cave with 3,000 feet of hard parts. Just take all the hard stuff and stick it all together, and that's what you get. And that's a long Vermont cave, but it does have some very nice large sections in it as well. And I'll walk you through some of the exploration, discovery, digging, and geology of this cave system. First thing I want to point out is that most of the passages in this cave are controlled by fault-related joints. There are 3 normal faults in the cave, the most significant of which is on the western edge of the cave system on the left side of the screen, but there are 2 other normal faults that we've observed in other parts of the cave as well. And then there's a bunch of joints that are related to the faults, either parallel or perpendicular, and quite a number at a 45-degree angle. And you can see where I've outlined the major passages and the major joints all sort of running together. When we initially found the cave, we got in with a very small amount of digging to this first short entry passage, and at the end of this passage we had to do a second dig through to the next spot. That involved quite a lot of rock deconstruction, and that took us through into the ice otter room, which at the time was completely full of ice, as you can see in this photo. Which is how it got its name. You had to slide down a belly crawl that was at a downhill angle and took you into this passage. And at this point, there seemed to be nowhere else to go, but as this was late April, we could actually hear a waterfall down through the floor somewhere down below. So we came back and once the ice had melted, dug through the rocks in the floor and were able to come through into the Twin Domes area. This is a close-up view of part of the original section of cave. You can see the entrance on the right, and then our first and second dig locations to get into the Twin Domes area, which had some upstream passage, downstream passage, a whole lot of stuff going on in different directions, a whole lot of water coming from a whole lot of places. So we were pretty excited to get into something like that in Vermont. The beginning of that passage is an 18-foot climb down as you come into the Twin Domes. And this gives you a sense of that climb. Emmett here is on a cable ladder because the walls, even though this would normally be a climbable 18-foot drop, the walls have very crumbly brown layers that tend to break off when you step on them. So we'd rigged a cable ladder there, we thought, for safety. And I just want to point out, Emmett is not on belay in this photo, and in fact, we had a rescue at this location. As you all know, it is the NSS policy to be on belay on a cable ladder, even if it's an easy cable ladder climb. And certainly if we had had a belay in this place, the rescue would not have had to happen. We had somebody fall off the ladder onto those rocks. They had some injuries, including a fractured rib, and had to be rescued from the cave. And that impacted our landowner relations, and we did not have access to the cave for the past 2 years because of that. And only this past couple of months have we been able to get back into the cave, and that's been impacted by the pandemic as well. So that's all I'm going to say about that. But cave safely. Don't assume that just because you can do something easily, everyone can do something easily. So once you get into the Twin Domes area, we had upstream passages and this pretty large joint-controlled downstream direction. And the cave does not travel horizontally really at all. It travels down, and then it travels in tight crawlways that zigzag over these crappy brown layers that you can see, which I'll get into it a little bit more, but these are a dolomitic matrix with a bunch of quartz grains and mica and various little layers of schist folded in. Sometimes it's really, really solid, and sometimes it's just break off in your hand, crumble away kind of stuff. So these have some control on how the cave is formed. From the Twin Domes passage, as you continue downstream, you basically just continue losing depth. You lose about 140 feet of depth between the entrance and the base level, only a few hundred feet away, and with no vertical pitches except for that 18-foot climb. Every climb is at a pretty steep angle, but it's just traveling down this major angled joint. At the bottom of that joint passage, you get into the shower dome area, which is where our initial exploration trip stopped. And that's also where we had to dig through to get to continuing downstream passage. However, there is an upper level also from that area, which we accessed through a couple of digs and a climb. And that is in the same joint as that major passage, but up higher in the joint. And there is a beautiful section, maybe some of the most beautiful passage in Vermont, where there's super thin blades of marble carved by dripping water. And you can see in a couple of these photos, I'll show you quite a few because it's really nice. The joint is angled at about 70 degrees. And as a result, the water that's pouring off of those brown layers cuts down into the blue marble, then gets stuck on a brown layer and rushes back out to the joint, and then again falls through the blue layers. And then that leads you very nice fluting and fins. It gives you a passageway where you have large 12-foot high monoliths that you have to climb over and around in order to get to the next section. And you don't want to fall on any of this stuff. It's quite sharp, as you can see in a few of these pictures. And it just sort of weaves in and out back along toward the Twin Domes, doubling back along the length of that lower passage. This upper passage just continues on and has all the water coming in from the upslope direction. All that water ends up at the bottom of the cave. And then from the fin rooms, which are in the upper right-hand side of this shot, you can see the water all comes down that joint and goes into the shower dome. And from there, we had to dig through the trap door, which you can see in the offset. And that took us into a separate infeeding stream, as well as a main stream coming back into the cave that we had lost earlier on. And that whole section of passage drains into a very unpleasant crawlway. For those of you who are thinking, oh, it's just a water crawl, just as a reminder, this is a passage in the mountains in Vermont. So the air temperature is like 46 degrees. The water temperature is more like 42. If you're laying full immersion in a bunch of water, it's not that great. From that section, though, we got very close to that first major fault that I was talking about. And we started to see these pretty huge gouges from fault minerals that are basically laminated along fractures in the rock. The gouge is itself flexible. We call these things floppy tortillas because you can pick them up and bend them and take them out, and they don't really seem like they should be rock, but when you dry them out and look at them very closely, they're all mineral. So I don't know, maybe Hazel Barton's got some ideas about this. Seems like there is maybe a biological component to me. Anyhow, you get through into passages on that fault, and that's where the highest part of the cave is. This is Jacob looking through the window into a room on the fault. And when you climb up out of that room through this fault breccia, you come up into the window dome, which is an 80-foot high dome with a waterfall coming in from the top and apparently visible passage off the side. Now, we did try to bolt climb this. I got up about as high as that first brown layer that you can see on the right-hand side of the photo. And that is unfortunately a couple of feet thick, and everything in it is crap. You can't put a bolt in that. If you touch it, it just falls apart. And the marble wall on the other side is so fractured by the faulting that when you tap it even a little bit, you get a very hollow sound, and large fins and pieces seem to want to shear off. So we kind of got stuck at that point. We haven't gone up this passage any farther because we don't really know how to get up there safely. It's too far into the cave for like a cable ladder climb with a scaling pole or anything like that. No scaling pole would fit to this point. This is the window dome right here in profile view. You can see it goes quite high up the fault in the breccia. It's probably not going to go to a bunch of significant new passage though, because as you can see, it goes relatively close to the surface up above, only 30 feet below the surface, more or less. So it's interesting and worthwhile, but it's not our top priority at the moment. Some of the downstream passages down to the left in the profile are much more interesting. So we went downstream from the window dome, which is the Miseries that I was talking about. This is a low water shot of the Miseries, when you only have to lay in 6 inches of water more or less instead of a foot of water rushing through you and up your coveralls and past you the whole time. It's not big. It goes on for 75 feet or so and takes a good 5 minutes to get through because you're laying in the water and squeezing against the rocks the whole way. Once you come out of it though, you're in a large collapse area. We had to do a second dig through the second Misery, which cuts through to Coral Falls back on the fault. Water sort of spins around, disappears into the floor again. This whole downstream end area of the cave is very fractured. It has a lot of debris coming down. And what we guess from various other experiences in the cave is that we're underneath a larger breakdown area in this location. So we've got solid air. We just have to figure out how to get up into where we want to go. And probably the best lead, which I'll mention again later, is the vomitorium. There's a good passage up there that's higher than the rest of that and also seems to be going into a breakdown area. So our hopes are stuck on that for the time being. Meanwhile, though, this was our first solid year of exploration in the first half of the cave. We decided to check over the following winter. Maybe there was another way in. Maybe there was some other stuff going on. There's a whole line of sinkholes all along the contact zone between the overlying schist and the underlying marble. And in fact, we found this sinkhole with 3 feet of snow melted right through 8 feet across. And we thought, all right, this is going to be excellent. That's definitely a way into some cave. And Bob Dion had been theorizing that there was this bigger cave passage parallel to the first section, just downhill. He was like, "Oh yeah, we're stuck in this upper level. We got to get into the big stuff downhill from here." I'm sure you all know diggers who have said things like that. Turns out he was right. So in the spring, we started working on that sinkhole and put in a couple of solid days and quickly got down far enough that we were poking into some open hollow down below and opened up what in total was about a 40-foot climb from the top of the sinkhole down to the bottom in the entrance passage, which is right about here. You can see this keyhole shape in the ceiling. So I mentioned the crappy brown layers that we have in this cave, and it seems like there's a bunch of phreatic tubes that were developed on top of these brown layers, and those tubes mostly run very slightly down dip, which is also very slightly uphill. And so I mentioned all the structural controls, the joints that are in this cave. And I think that what's happening is a lot of water comes in, does vadose enhancement on these fault-related joints. And then whenever it gets to one of these brown layers where it doesn't quite get through, it diverts into phreatic tubes and jumps to another joint that way. And that's, unfortunately, that means that at the end of that entrance passage in the Mr. Toad's Wild Ride entrance, we got to the Tunnel of Love, which was just one of those tubes heading into the wall, only about 6 inches in diameter, sometimes smaller, occasionally larger, but full of gravel. So we decided, hey, the air's coming out of there. I guess we got to go that way. And we did go that way. So toward the end of this year, while other people were digging in the miseries, this would be 2015, some other people were getting the nice, dry, warm dig in the Tunnel of Love. And that involved squeezing in as far as you can, breaking rock, filling sleds, pulling debris back out, initially by backing out of the tube while hugging rocks, and sometimes eventually by backing into the tube as far as you could go, shoveling dirt into the sled, having somebody pull the sled out, and then using your one hand that you can move to pull the sled back in towards you so you can fill it up with some more gravel. Lots of fun. It's just big enough for the biggest person because we don't have space to spare, so we don't have none of this like wheelbarrow sized dig passage. We can't afford that. So just big enough is sort of comfortable if you're a Northeast caver, and insane if you're not. This is our biggest guy, Mike Teladira, trying to fit through the Tunnel of Love, which is big enough for him. He does get through here, and I bet a bunch of you who are his same size, caving in bigger places, would not think you could. You can. So we followed the Tunnel of Love for a solid 75 feet, went to another zigzag, and then through some more crawlway, and dug out into this rigging room, which is the top of the 38-foot pit. And so we were pretty delighted to get in here. We figured, all right, we've broken into that big parallel Bob was talking about. We're in great shape. So in this section, you can see the Wild Ride entrance dig over on the right, Tunnel of Love running through the middle there, and then the 38-foot pit in profile and in the plan view. So this is the 38-foot drop. It's very pretty. Just like in the fin rooms, at each of the drops, you've got these little micro fins formed under each of the brown layers where the dripping water runs and cuts into the blue calcitic marble. Really nice. This room is also on a fault. In this shot, you can see, especially in the top left, that there's a couple feet of fault displacement. There's a large section of brown marble that's displaced down a couple feet here on the left side. And this fault, unfortunately, doesn't show up anywhere else in the cave. It's the cave comes in, has a pit right on the fault, and then the passage just zigzags right off the fault again in a different joint heading in another direction. This is the downstream from that 38-foot pit. It's pretty great, looks excellent, looks like it's going to go, but despite being nice passage with nice marble for a little bit, it quickly becomes very small. So again, we're following the air. Again, we're in these tubes, and we got into this section we called bumper cars because we were spending a lot of time moving around, turning around corners. We joked that we felt like tractor trailers in this section because you have to come around the corner one way, back up into another passage, and then turn around again so that you can go back out of the cave more or less head first. But we didn't give up. We kept at it for quite some time, got through some collapse areas, got through to another stream crawl. That would be this one, with collapse on the left and carved marble on the right. We knew we were close to something. We knew the air was coming through. We knew we were in the right course. In fact, we were. So the bumper cars dig in the top middle here led through underneath some breakdown section out into the fissure room and up through another crawlway back over into the overlying breakdown room, the funhouse, which has a bunch of passages at different levels, big breakdown slope, and eventually leads to the funhouse pit room, which is the tallest room in Vermont with a roof at this point at 120 feet high. So here's the fissure room where we came in after the bumper cars dig. And here's the entrance of the funhouse where you come out at the top level. Bob is coming out of, in the blue, coming out of the crawlway that came from the Fisher room right there. So this swings down to a mid-level passage in the lower funhouse, and then that passage leads to the funhouse pit room. It comes in about 60 feet off the floor, and here Morgan is about 50 feet off the floor at the top of the rappel to get to the base. So heading down that pit room, which I mentioned at convention a couple years ago, we thought, this is pretty excellent. We're getting into Big Canyon down there. It's looking like it's just going to go. And it does get into Big Passage down there for a little bit. But that passage on the uphill side is a wall of glacial till. Now, the fact that this till is even here is pretty interesting because there's no clear way that this could have gotten in. This part of the cave doesn't have any access to the surface large enough to account for the pieces of schist that are in this till. So this is something interesting that we haven't quite figured out, but there must have been pretty significant different topography during the past 15,000 years when till would have been pushed in here by the glaciers, or before that. So from the funhouse, we discovered there was no way to go, and so we went back up to the funhouse proper, and found Larry's passage heading downstream in a completely different direction. Nice crawlway, and some nice digs at the end of that, including one we called trench warfare that was really unpleasant and didn't go. And the more important one, the one that did go and connected us to the original section of cave system. And that connection brought us the full 3,300 feet of cave, a solid through trip that we still haven't done because of the rescue. But at some point in hopefully this year, we'll be able to do the first official through trip, even though we've reached the same place from both sides with the survey. So this is what it looks like heading south out of the funhouse. You go down the breakdown slope and get into Larry's passage, which we almost overlooked because the water just disappears into a drain in the floor and you have to double back to get into this crawlway. At the end of that, you've got a nice little section we had to dig through, and that took us eventually to the warm and dry passage on the opposite side. Originally, we had looked at this cave and called it the warm and dry passage because it was the only section in the original cave that didn't have water raining out of the ceiling. It's not warm and it's not dry. So here's the whole cave now in profile. And I want to point out some of the interesting geological elements that are going on here. The normal faults you can see are crossing the passage in a couple of locations. And the three on the left-hand side are all the same fault, just crossing the passage at an angle in a few different spots. So you've got the original entrance in the middle where you drop down, you hit the Twin Domes area, and then you can come down to the base level of the cave for that section. And you've got the fin rooms in the middle. You cut through there, you get to the window dome, you go all the way downstream, and then the water disappears. Meanwhile, just downhill, you've got this whole parallel in the wild ride side of the cave where, again, we've got massive development vertically in some places, but then lots of these tiny little tube passages going horizontally. And in this profile, I've extrapolated the geology from all the places we observed it in the cave. And I'll point out in particular something interesting happening in the bottom right-hand side at the funhouse. So the upper levels of marble in this cave, I'm fairly sure, are an undocumented exposure of the Whipple marble, which occurs only in lenses and small exposures on top of Bascom-Belden's marble and sometimes by itself near the contact in the Taconic range that I mentioned earlier. So at the bottom of the funhouse pit room, we actually see the Bascom-Belden's marble. We can see a clear contact between this bedded marble with the deep blue calcite marble and these brown dolomitic beds with all kinds of bad minerals in there that make your rope go sandpapery. And then in the bottom of the funhouse pit room, you hit this blue-gray massive calcitic marble and butynated orange dolomitic marble, which is much more like the Bascom-Belden's at the contact in most other exposures. So what I'm theorizing at this point is that most of the cave at present is formed in Whipple marble on top of the Baskin-Beldens. That's extremely promising as far as the potential for this cave system, because the Baskin-Beldens is the largest cave-forming marble in Vermont, and then under the Baskin-Beldens you have the Shelburne, which is the next largest cave-forming marble in Vermont and contains Vermont's second largest cave. So for geologic context here, you've got the cave up at the contact on the side of the mountains, and then directly below you've got the Baskin-Beldens marble, and then the Shelburne marble, and then the Clarendon Springs dolomite and the Cheshire quartzite. So all of the water that's coming into this cave is coming in off the schist and sinking either in the Whipple or at the top of the Baskin-Beldens. There's no water on the surface in the Shelburne, and almost no water on the surface in the Clarendon Springs. Where the Clarendon Springs dolomite exists, the upper level overflow resurgences come out there, and then a bunch of resurgences come out at the bottom of Clarendon Springs and into the Cheshire quartzite. Now, because of where the cave is located, even though we have 202 feet of surveyed depth, the potential depth is still 1,000 to 1,100 feet, because the water from the cave definitively does not come back out of the hill until Clarendon Springs. So we've got a lot of cave-forming rock here, we've got a lot of potential, and we're hoping we're going to get somewhere good. So I'm going to take you quickly through a couple of the digs that remain in the cave. We've got the pyrated streamway that comes off the twin domes. You might have seen it on the map as a little finger sticking off in one direction. Now, this is only interesting because it could potentially head to another parallel passage, not because it would take us downstream. So it's not a high priority, but it's one we've been working on. The bottom of the funhouse pit itself has a drain. That drain is mostly clogged with debris, but it is taking a good amount of water. And because there are multiple drainages in the cave, they do not all come together. Anywhere that water is getting down to a lower level is interesting. And this is already in the Baskin-Beldens marble and potentially a good route to follow. It's not the route the air is coming from. Most of the air is coming from downstream beyond the Miseries and from a breakdown room that we spotted in the ceiling while we were digging the connection. We have not yet been able to get into that breakdown room because it requires disassembling some rocks that are over your head, and we'll come back to that at some point when it's safer. The vomitorium, however, is running over the top of the Miseries and headed downstream. There's also air in this section coming from downstream, and on the far side of this, we had a breakdown slope with rocks tumbling down on the far side. The only trouble is there's this dome in the ceiling that has a bunch of slop that continually pours out of the ceiling. So no matter how much of it you remove, more of it seems to just pour on out of there in order to fill it back up. And so we have to figure out a way past that in order to get to the air and the debris slope, but we think we can manage that. And then of course, you've got the Miseries itself at base level. You can see Tom here looking up past the ceiling at one of the collapse points at the end. And here you can look up a good 15 feet along the ceiling and along the debris pile. We're not super enthusiastic about digging into that debris pile, but it does have air coming out of it, so it's possible. So this is where the cave stands at present, Vermont's longest cave system, 3,300 feet. But there's quite a lot of potential for something more, and we're really hoping that this is going to be the one that takes us down to minus hundreds of feet and really shows us what happens to all this water inside the mountains. Second round of exploration, whenever the pandemic is over, when we can go back and do more significant cave trips again and more safely have a bunch of people together. For the time being, thanks to everybody in the Berkshire Area Diggers Association, especially the people who show up over and over again to dig in these places. We get solid rewards, but it's not easy.